What's happening, folks? T Staley, I'm back again with the next video in this little series of random source search overviews and tips and stuff. This video, we're taking a look at the Resonant Equalizer, or the Res EQ, as it's also known as. This, again, is a very interesting and very unique equalizer, and another one of Serge's fantastic modules. I'll probably sound a bit like a broken record saying this sort of stuff now, but it's pretty true in my opinion. This is no exception. This is well, on the surface it's an equalizer. It's a bank of filters that you can use to shape sounds tonally, just the frequency content and just the overall tonal balance of sounds, but it's a little bit more than that, which might not be obvious at first glance, but hopefully we can unpack some of that today in this video, and hopefully you can find some helpful info to take away and use in your patching and your playing. So let's just dive into it. We'll cover the panel, what's on the panel and what we're faced with, ins and outs, and what's on the panel, and then we'll dive into some sound examples and patch ideas and so on. So okay, looking at the front, you can see we have 10 bands, or 10 frequency bands that can be adjusted, and these are lined up here on the left half of the module. I've got grey pots or grey knobs on my pots in this particular build that I've put together. I guess I'll note this is available as a DIY module, and if you're going to build it, you've got a choice of what type of capacitors you can use in the build, and depending on what you decide on, it will affect the actual sound of the module. In particular, when you come to using the feedback, which I will get to, but it's just something you might want to bear in mind if you are thinking about putting one of these together. I have used polystyrene caps in my build, and they're quite popular in building this module. They have a very nice, very raw sort of quality to the sound, and I haven't actually been able to do any one-on-one comparisons with builds using other types of capacitors, but from my understanding there are some pretty notable differences depending on what you decide to use. So this particular video and my build will be demonstrating the sound of a Resonant EQ that has polystyrene caps in the circuits. So just keep that in mind. Let's go on. So like I was saying, we have the frequency bands here, and these are spaced out at a pretty interesting it's a pretty interesting design choice in how Serge has decided on these specific bands, like frequency bands. Besides the bottom frequency and the top frequency of 29 Hertz and 11K respectively, they're all spaced at intervals of a major seventh, which it was decided on because it sort of equates to the spacing where you can actually achieve like natural formant type qualities in the adjustments. So like it's really handy in like shaping sounds and achieving natural sounding formants. So That just gives more natural kind of sound to the output signal, and just like reminiscent of qualities of like real acoustic and natural sound. So it's this is just an interesting design choice and pretty useful. And you'll find, like, once you've used it a bit, it's got a pretty unique kind of sound as far as EQs go. Yeah, obviously, it's not like there's 10 bands, which is nice. Like, it's not like your typical sort of graphic EQ or shoving filters. They do tend to interact with each other, which is it's hard to explain. It's kind of something that's easier to demonstrate in practice, which I'll get to. But yeah, like adjusting one band will affect the frequency of other bands within the bank. So that's something that you would need to bear in mind as well. So I guess we'll move on to what's on the right hand side of the panel. In the top right corner of the panel, you can see there's a small box. This contains our outputs. So there's two main signal outputs at the very top, and these are identical. There's no discernible difference as to which one of these you use. They're both the same. Underneath we have these two comb outputs, and these are different outputs. Comb 1 outputs the sum of the frequency bands that are running on the very left hand side, these frequency bands here, and comb 2 is a summed output of these right hand side frequency bands. So that's useful in, I guess, applications like sort of creating sort of a pseudo stereo kind of effect. If you were to use both outputs separated, you know, one's running to the left and the other to the right, it becomes pretty interesting when you use either of these outputs in a feedback loop, and I'll demonstrate some of that shortly. But it's just nice to get just different balances at the outputs, like different frequency band balances that are somewhat different. So yeah, I guess you can sort of think about how you might use that and apply it. There's probably a lot of different ways you can do that, so it's just worth exploring. Moving on, under this in the center, you can see we have this feedback potentiometer and a toggle switch beside it, which is a phase polarity toggle switch. So you can have positive feedback, or toggling the switch inverts the feedback, which becomes negative. And I guess the difference is really pretty stark when you use it. Like it's definitely more noticeable when it's left in the typical positive feedback position, which would be the same as if you're patching from the output straight back to one of the inputs, for instance. And this is obviously just a attenuator. You can use it to control the amount of feedback going back to the normal input, which you don't see, but yeah, just controls the level of feedback more or less. But like I was saying, with positive feedback, you're gonna introduce a lot of wild non-linearity and distortion, so it gets really freaky and crazy, and yeah, it's heaps of fun. If you flick the polarity switch down into negative, you get negative feedback. It's like a phase inverted signal coming from the output back to the input. So this effectively gives us phase cancellation at the specific frequency bands that you choose and adjust, which is pretty useful, you know, that's nice to have. And then underneath at the very bottom right hand side we have two input jacks and attenuators or gain control potentiometers, and I think they're both identical. They're pretty much identical as far as I know, and it's just useful to have two inputs for a lot of applications. You know, it's quite a really great module for exploring feedback patches. It's one of its strengths. Beyond having the feedback, like internal feedback controls here, having more than one input and output really allows this module to shine when you use concepts of feedback patching. So, for instance, you can take one output and further process it with wave shapers or filters and delays and whatever, and then you still have another input you can use to bring that signal back in. And yeah, it gets very exciting and yeah, loads of fun to explore. And you can also just directly use the comb outputs patched back to one of the inputs, which also creates very interesting feedback. So there's quite a bit there to explore as far as feedback goes, and I highly encourage exploring this side of the module. It's what a lot of people get excited about with this module, beyond just the typical standard EQ applications and tonal shaping and so on. I guess we'll just jump into some sound examples and demonstrate how this thing actually works in practice. So I'm just going to plug our output, take our output from there, and then I'll just run it's just a pulse wave coming from an NTO to the first input here. And I've just got a spectrum analyzer open inside of Bitwig here that's going to show us the response of this equalizer. So this is feedback all the way at the minimum, so there's no actual feedback occurring, and the bands are all very much centered at 12 o'clock, which means that they're neutral. There's no cut or boost. So with these bands, if we turn from 12 and we go counterclockwise, we're going to reduce the band, effectively cut the band at that frequency. And there's quite a pretty it's a pretty drastic amount of reduction on the cut side of things. Like, I wouldn't say it totally cancels, but it's very effective. And likewise, when we boost, if we boost, say, anywhere past 3 o'clock, going clockwise, the bands start to resonate. So that's why it gets its name, Resonant Equalizer. Like, these bands begin to oscillate at high levels. It's effectively boosting those bands beyond, an extra 12 dB. So I'm just going to push some of these up, and you can hear how effectively that is altering the tonal quality of the signal. Cut that band there. So there's really a lot of flexibility here as far as tone shaping goes. It may be so low we might not hear. 61 Hertz is probably noticeable. And if we turn the feedback up, where you need to be careful because you can easily overload and freak this module out with feedback, but you'll notice the bands start to oscillate at their specific frequencies at sufficient levels of feedback. And there you can start hearing that oscillation. And you'll notice once this starts oscillating that all the different bands affect one another, like I was saying earlier. So the resonant frequency will really depend on how you have these bands adjusted in conjunction with one another. More feedback. So you can hear that, those interesting non-linearities and the distortion. It's really pretty remarkable. You can hear how that frequency shifts when we move some of these bands around. Turn that gain up more. So you get some really awesome harmonic interactions and just pleasing results, you know. At full amounts of feedback, it just starts howling and just brutal. So that's just like a basic demonstration of, you know, like a sort of static pulse wave or square wave at the input. It can self-oscillate with, you know, enough feedback. Like if we just crank the feedback without any input, you hit a point where it just starts to self-oscillate. And once again, the bands will interact with what frequency it oscillates at, but it's got a very distinctive quality to the sound. So it's awesome for like really aggressive industrial kind of heavy distorted drones and just noisy timbres, you know. But a lot of people have raised the point that there's no CV inputs on this module, and I guess I don't really think this module needs CV over each band. It might be interesting to have that, but because it's so unpredictable and the bands are so dependent on one another as to how they behave, I think having CV would make it even less predictable and probably really difficult to work with. So I don't find it detrimental not having that CV control, but it's very much a playable, hands-on type of module. It sort of begs to be tweaked, and it's very inviting. And I don't want to get carried away, but yeah, you get the idea. It really just needs to be played with to get the most out of it. It's not really something you would just want to set signals to modulate and I don't think that would sort of work as well either. Like I think it would be too hard to predict on how you would want to modulate it anyway. So I don't really find the need to have CV control. I don't think it's an oversight by Serge on not having it. So I guess I'll move on to some more examples. We'll show the negative feedback. So you get phase cancellation. Let's just patch that signal back in. Sorry, I'll just patch that back in again. So we've got that pulse wave. Turn that up moderately high. It can get pretty hot at the outputs because of the feedback and so on. But there's quite a bit of gain at the bands each way too when you increase the boost. So if we flip the phase on this feedback and then increase the amount, you can start to get phase cancellation. So neutralize those back again to the center, increase that feedback depth, and then as we increase the boost now, you may notice at these frequencies it doesn't oscillate so much. It's just shift the balance and reduce some of these. So if we turn that feedback up more, we're starting to see a reduction in the harmonics. So it's useful for attenuating. And if you use I guess it wouldn't work so much with the switch here, but the comb outputs can be useful if you want to get either boost or cut of specific bands, and then feed back those to the output. So I guess just to demonstrate what I'm talking about here, we patch this up and take the comb one output and just patch that back into the second input here, and straight away we can hear that feedback at one of these high, I think this is 5.2k, so it's pretty high frequency, and there's no feedback on the internal feedback parameter here. It's all coming from this second input here. So we bring the first input signal up. And then increase the actual positive feedback of, flip that actually, so it'll be negative, and then positive feedback from the comb output. So just adjusting those balances can yield some pretty interesting tonal results. Just change that wave shape and use a sawtooth. Yeah, so add a bit of cut on some of these bands as well. Yeah, again, you can spend hours just adjusting these parameters and just finding very nice tonal sounds. Like, it's just got a very pleasing quality. So I guess it gets pretty interesting. I might just show one more example before I wrap this up. I don't want to drag this video on for too long. I will take one of these comb outputs again. I might use the second one in this case. And I'll patch up this sequence from my Renee, and then I will patch the oscillator to the VCA, and then that can come to the input down here. And we're going to feed one of these comb outputs to, actually we'll feed both of them. I'll show you this sort of neat patch. We'll use both comb outputs, and I'm going to send these through a sequential switch and then just switch between them as the sequence plays. And you'll notice just how sort of effective the different comb outputs can be when used for feedback. So that can go back from the delay to the second input. And let's hear our sequence. And I'll just bring all these bands back to flat 12 o'clock. And then now we'll just bring in some of this feedback, which is being delayed. I'll turn that feedback back for now. So you can hear these different comb outputs being switched. Just getting the balances on the levels going into the delay can make a fair difference too. So it's quite sensitive to input levels, and obviously that affects the feedback as well. Invert that internal feedback. So it gets pretty interesting when you start processing the feedback as well. It gets pretty unruly. You obviously need to be careful where you boost and cut. there's that. There's some other patch ideas. You can actually ping the EQ like you would a filter, like any other kind of filter. It takes a bit of finicky, tuning to get a really nice sort of pinging result, but it's definitely possible and worth trying. It's definitely got a unique kind of sound to it when you ping this EQ. There's another idea for patching. Yeah, just sort of, I guess it's not it's not to be underestimated as just like an EQ. Also, like it just sounds really, really nice for tonal shaping as far as like synthesis goes. Like you can use it on just about any kind of signal and get very pleasing results. So yeah, that's why it's highly revered, like a lot of Serge's modules. But yeah, it's definitely a self-contained playground. So I'm going to leave it there. If you've got questions or suggestions, comments, any of that stuff, feel free to drop us a line and I will get back to you. And then, yeah, hopefully you can stick around for my next video. So thanks for watching and I'll see you then.